mega churches, money manipulation, miracle offerings, and other things that might make you a little sick to your stomach. Those are all topics of today's conversation. On this episode of the Church Disrupted podcast, we continue the conversation we started last week in our Miracle Offering documentary. And we talk about New Testament giving, stewardship, when giving is good, but also what happens when giving goes bad in the church, when offerings become scams, and everything in between. You are not going to want to miss this conversation. And in this conversation, we are going to show you how to give generously, how to look like Jesus in your giving, how to make a difference in this season, yet at the same time, how to recognize when churches just want your money or when the offering a church is talking about may have become a scam. We're going to arm you with questions that you can ask, things that you can do to make sure that your money is going to the places that you want it to go, that's making the greatest impact possible. And we even talk to pastors about how you can separate your church as a transparent and trusted church in today's environment. All of that on this episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. So if you're ready, let's dive in together. All right, guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. I'm here today joined by Shawn Reece and Buck Flemming. And today we're going to do a little bit different of an episode. Instead of talking about a brand new topic, we're actually going to dive into just our responses and insights and just the things we've been thinking about over the last week since the documentary came out about miracle offerings and money manipulation. So we're going to help you guys. That was 2 hours and 45 minutes long. This will not be 2 hours and 45 minutes long because we want to give you some time back there. But no, we just want to talk about that. And this is actually the start. The documentary was the start of a series that we're doing with a couple of breaks. But most of the episodes through the end of the year, and maybe some at the beginning of the year, are going to be part of a larger series called The Church That Business Built. The church that business built. We're talking about how worldly business tactics have gotten into the church in a way that has twisted it, that's allowed for spiritual abuse. Some of the things are good and can be redeemed. Some of the things need to get out of there. Others just need tweaks. But this is really the second part of that series, the church that business built. And of course, we're starting with money because money can be so damaging. Money can be so manipulative. But also money's something that we all deal with. As any pastor who does a miracle offering will tell you, the Bible talks a lot about money. So we'll talk about it as well. But before we jump in today, I really wanted to let you highlight, Buck. Yesterday, you texted me and you actually said, because I didn't even know before yesterday that you were doing this, but you actually went to one of our partners, Rob Scott in the Forgiveness Link. You got to do a session with him. And you just texted me yesterday. You said, dude, I'm wrecked. So tell our listeners, because I didn't know you were doing that, but tell them how, you don't have to tell them why you went or anything like that, but just tell them a little bit about the impact that Rob had on you yesterday in session number 1.
So I'll say why I went. I found myself recently showing up in conversations with my wife in ways that I didn't want to show up. And so then, I'm like, man, and literally I was like, I'm responding like a 3-year-old. And so then it hit me the other day. I'm like, I am responding in as much grace as possible for my level of maturity in this level area of my life. But I really knew like I was showing up like a 3-year-old, and I didn't tell Rob that. I was like, hey dude, let's get together, have a session. I've known Rob for a while. And so the first thing he says, he goes, man, he goes, I think this is something from when you were about 3 years old. And I'm like, okay. Cause
that explains why you're acting like a 3-year-old.
Yeah. So anyway, we dove into it, and there has been a memory for me that I've always hung on and really got into it. And when, without giving too many details, but by the time we were done with that session, our session, I felt 100 pounds lighter. I'd love to be physically 100 pounds lighter, but but I felt so much lighter, and I just felt so much peace. And I had just pulled over in a parking lot. We did a Zoom meeting, and I'd pulled over in a parking lot because I couldn't make it anywhere else before the meeting started. I wanted to be at home. But I was like, I don't even know if I should be driving. So I just felt so much just peace. And I mean, totally. So
one session online virtually, and man, you just couldn't stop talking about it. 8 sessions, he can do so much. But I wanted Buck to talk about that just because Rob is one of our partners along with the East Tennessee Mentorship Association. So the Forgiveness Link is where you went with Rob Scott. Dustin Stitt and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association team is also one of our partners. I wanted you guys to hear it from Buck this time because these are real people doing really, really good things. They're not just people who are paying us money or something like that. These are people that we believe in. And they actually don't pay us any money, these guys, unless you guys go to them, because we're not in this for money. We just want to make sure that you have a place to go heal. And I've been to Rob, but to hear Buck's story as well. I think it's cool, Buck, because we won't spend much time on this, but you went a few years ago and you weren't ready. It was because it's really deep. You got to be, you got to want change when you go to Rob, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna tell you, you go to the Forgiveness Link, you got to be ready to invest and want change. You weren't ready yet, and you said after about 3 sessions, you hadn't given him enough. You weren't really opening up, so you stopped because you weren't comfortable going where you wanted to go. And I just think 3 years ago, if you had known Dustin Stitt in East Tennessee Mentorship Association, they would have been perfect for you. Where you were as a guy who didn't want to open up yet, they would have walked at a pace that would have helped to get you there, right? So it's kind of 2 levels almost of care with the Forgiveness Link and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association. But I'm telling you, I would trust my family. And I would trust my friends with any of them. So anyway, I wanted our listeners to hear that, Buck, and I'm glad that, super glad that it helped. But I'm also glad to know I'm not the only person that was a puddle on the floor when I finished my first session with Rob.
Yeah, and the way my 3-year-old shows up is by hiding. So that is the way. I just go hide, and I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. So and that's what I was doing 3 years ago when I went to Rob, is I was still hiding. I've just had a lot going on that's exposed that hiding, and I'm like, okay, why am I hiding here? So, and it just, I feel like I received a ton of healing. So, pretty excited about that.
So, no matter where you're at, what kind of trauma you're holding, whether that's church hurt, spiritual abuse, or something else, like I said, mental health wizards, man. Mental health wizards. They help you find stuff you had no idea was causing the issue. You didn't go in there yesterday going, this is an issue being caused by something that happened when I was 3. But it was. So anyway, super powerful stuff. But we got about an hour or so to have this conversation today. We don't want to take it too long, but guys, y'all watch the documentary. Okay? You have each been a part of some of these miracle offerings in different places. None of our experiences are the same. And we've had some people ask, the churches that were featured, very few of them do I have any connection with. Do y'all have any connection with, right? Most of them, this was just research. And the few that we did have connection with, we actually hit lighter than we would have if we didn't have connection with them. But we've all experienced some of these miracle offering type pieces very different ways. Shawn, you've had probably some more inner circle type experiences than I have in some of them. So we all watched the documentary. Of course, I did the documentary. It's going to hit us different ways. I mean, I just want to talk and have a conversation that a lot of our listeners are kind of having. We're getting a ton of stories in. If you got a story that you want to share, good, bad, or ugly about miracle offerings, let us know. But out of all the stories, one of the threads that just keeps coming up is time and time again, guilt and shame. I gave money that I didn't feel good about giving. I didn't feel called to give. I had a check in my spirit about giving. But I felt like I was cheating God, or that was just my flesh, or that I was going to be stealing from God, and all these things. So you have stories of people giving money they didn't have, put them in a bind, put God in a bind of, God, are you going to take care of me because my pastor said this? So y'all may have had some of those experiences as well. I don't know. But just from your experience, I would love to talk about what stuck out to you and what insights you gleaned from the documentary. Maybe anything that you think we didn't hit that kind of hit your mind and you're like, people should know this. Kind of anything in that money realm. We're not talking about tithing and day-to-day expenses a ton, but anything in that money realm with miracle offerings or how that money's spent is fair game today.
Well, something you said, you got a bunch of stories of like, I didn't feel good about giving this money, and I've actually experienced that quite a bit because, being in ministry, you don't typically make a ton of money. Now you can, to be fair,
Unless you're C-suite. C-suite usually makes good, and everybody else
I have
makes
stories about that I probably shouldn't say here, but maybe for another time. But I felt that, and there have been times where I gave more than I had, more than I needed to. Like I gave, bill money. Like, hey, we need to pay this bill, but we're not going to pay this bill this month. We're gonna, if God doesn't show up, it's just going to be late, or we'll figure it out some other time.
And I've heard that a lot because God will show up if I'm giving to this offering.
And so we did it, and after I did it, like immediately, it's kind of like buyer's remorse. Like oh, I shouldn't have done that. I began to think like, is this being a good steward? Because that's another principle of finances that we're taught heavily in the church. And like, you got to be a good steward of your finances. A lot of times you're in your financial situation because of stuff you've done. And is this one of those things that I've done that I shouldn't have done? And so
the church never talks about being a good steward when they're talking about sacrificial giving.
Absolutely not.
They don't talk about those at the same time, right?
Well, because that doesn't work.
Well, and that's the thing, Shawn, is that's not the only story that I've heard like that. People who were like, hey, I didn't have the money. I had already decided there's no money for me to give. It's not that I'm not being generous. I'm already tithing. I'm doing all these things. But then as the pastors were talking about it, as other people were giving, they felt like they were being unfaithful. They just didn't have enough belief. I guess this is what they mean by sacrifice. Yeah. And I don't think all the pastors who say that stuff even mean that. They don't know how people are taking this idea, right? But people don't want to displease God. So, one person talked to me about it, and they said, I felt so guilty because everybody else was giving. I didn't have really any money. I knew we weren't supposed to be giving. Like, we barely had money to buy food for the next couple of days. And I scrounged through my purse until I found a $5 bill crumpled up, and I threw that in, and that was literally the last pennies to my name. But I didn't want to look bad. I wanted to have something to put in the envelope and take up in this miracle offering.
So, your motivations along with, how it's gotten there. There are times where I believe that God will put it in your heart to give something that you feel like, hey, I really don't have this. But it's not because somebody came up and said, God's going to give you a miracle or bless you. Or it's not because somebody came up and said, if you don't do this, you don't have enough faith. It's something you've already got. And maybe something that a pastor says will confirm it. Like, I really do need to do that because I've been feeling this. And there are people who give in those offerings who have that, I'm sure. Yeah. But it's just not always the case. I think that's kind of something that needs to be said is, where are you at before you hear about this offering? And sometimes, I've been a part of big churches that will say, months out, even a year out, like, hey, the day after they give their offering, don't forget to start preparing for next year's offering.
It's like you're going to a conference, because I've ran conferences. Hey guys, last day of the conference, don't forget you can do early bird registration today for the best price ever. Think about what you're going to give in next year's offering. Go ahead and start preparing, because if you felt bad, if you didn't feel like you could give enough this year, prepare next year so that you don't have to feel bad. Well, but here's the thing. What does the New Testament teach? Paul said, give generously as you've decided in your heart to give. So if God wasn't nudging you to give before they told you about the offering, then he didn't call you to give. It's about what God's called you to give, not what stories people have told you to rile you up, right?
So for me, my question is, how much money does it cost to make disciples?
It costs time to make disciples. That's what we don't want to give.
That's what we don't want to give, and that's what the Western culture doesn't want to give. Because you know what? We still want to be out in our cars or in our houses or doing on the lake. I got a boat. I love going to the lake. But I'd rather be out there than giving up my time to make a disciple, because that's cheap. So it's it's cheaper to give a lot of times than it is to give money than it is to give time. And then we've created professional Christians, and what we're actually doing is being a Christian doesn't require finances. I think it might cost a cup of coffee, but I can go get a cup of coffee from my kitchen and sit down at my kitchen table instead of going to Starbucks and paying $8 for a fancy latte. No, I'd much rather meet somebody at Starbucks and buy them a latte but then you're up to $20 by the time you tip. But it doesn't cost money to make a disciple. It costs something far more valuable, and that's our heart. It's giving people and sharing our heart and giving people access to the real us,
Yeah.
And, and it really comes back down. It's not just the pastors that are operating in the love of money. It's that when we respond like that, we're operating in the love of money because we're acting like money is the most valuable thing we have.
Well, a lot of times we're operating out of a fear response because the pastor said something like, "Hey, if you're not generous, you're stealing from God, you're cheating from God, you're doing all those things." And a lot of times we talk about that with the tithe, but it's kind of gotten over to the miracle offerings now. And even when we don't, people have a hard time separating it, everyday Christians. So a lot of times what happens is I don't want to miss a blessing because I didn't give.
Right.
Because the people most desperate for a blessing are the people who don't have money. The people who are most desperate for a miracle are the people who have the least amount of money. But they're like, "Hey, I don't want to miss this miracle I desperately need because I wasn't faithful enough to give sacrificially. I'm scared of letting God down." They give out of fear, but what does Scripture say? God didn't give us a spirit of fear. He gave us a spirit of love, of self-discipline, of a sound mind, right? Power. Love, and a sound mind. And part of that, the fruit of the Spirit, it's self-control. God, did you call me to give this, or do I just feel stirred up by these stories? But that is really hard when you're sitting in a room and everybody is giving and the soft music is playing and the air conditioning has been turned down and it feels like the Holy Spirit's moving. So when all those things are happening,
too, man.
it feels...
Spirit haze.
Yes, and it's really hard, guys, to not do that. So we know how difficult that is, and we know that churches need money. Like, there's nothing wrong with churches asking for money. I think this needs to be said. I said it in the documentary, but I'm not sure that everybody caught it. There's nothing wrong with churches asking for money during this season, especially when they say, "Hey, a couple of things I think are really good. One, we have a shortfall and we're not paying our bills, or we have a big budget shortfall. Here's why. Here's what we need. If you feel called to give, we would really appreciate your help." Okay. Yeah. Another one that I think is fine is, "Hey guys, we're totally fine, but we know in the end of the year, a lot of people want to give for tax purposes and generosity and everything else. And we would love to be the recipient of your gift, because here's what we'll promise you. We're always going to put this toward reaching people for Jesus, and you'll never waste an investment here." I think that is totally fine, right? It's when we turn it into these miracle offerings where we use tons of stories to rile people up. And you guys saw in the documentary, we talk about tons of like brochures and pictures and everything else. Most of the stuff where it says this is where the money's going, because a lot of them print up brochures for this, we make it look like the money's going places it doesn't go because people get excited about those stories. And then what it does is it comes back into the ministry. And Shawn, you and I know you've seen it. I don't know if Buck has seen it, but you and I have watched hundreds of thousands of dollars be wasted in a moment. Hey, let's just throw that away. We don't need it anymore.
You and I broke the credit card thing for a massive church 1 year.
Yeah, well, no one could spend any money, but that was a whole different story. The money we were spending was pretty crazy. It's for an event, it's for a conference.
Yeah, I mean, it
got wild.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
it got wild. But it's really easy for churches to, even when they have all this money, because the churches that are asking for these miracle offerings, one of the things that stuck out to me most was I couldn't stop sighing. Like, it was such a spirit of heaviness when I was walking through those financial statements that don't show us how they're spending their money, just the money they have. But when I was walking through that, I thought about how we used to spend money in some of the churches I was in. And I was like, well, that's why it's so easy to waste. Because think about the money that they have, the assets they have, the money that's coming in. You always assume it's coming in again. And then outside of the tithe, you're doing these miracle offerings for millions of dollars at a time. And people don't realize there are people who are sacrificing their very last penny, not paying bills, not being able to eat, struggling. And then you got the church that took the money a couple of months later, throwing away hundreds of thousands of dollars of decorations that they just don't want anymore, that was bought with that tithe money. And it's not anybody trying to be evil. It's just such a disconnect from, we forgot that people were sacrificially giving for this.
Yeah. Well, and I've been a part of, I was a marketing director at a very large church. And so I've been a part of all of the creation of the brochures and all, like, going through all this stuff.
You've also seen a lot of the churches we talked about, because everybody's learning from everybody. It's the same playbook.
It's all the same stuff. Yeah. And so I've been in conversations. In fact, towards the end of me being there, the last couple of years, aside from COVID, because the year that COVID really hit, 2020, that was my last year there. And so that was a whole different ballgame. But about 2018, 2019, I started having conversations because they would do some of the same initiatives every year. and or they would come up with new stuff, and I would bring it up that, hey, we haven't done the things that we said we were going to do last year, and there's various reasons. Some of them are legit, and I don't know all of them. I don't know all the ins and outs. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just saying, like, we haven't done this, and so the conversation I'd be like, well, if people can't trust you, they're not going to want to give. If you say you're going to do this and then they don't see it, the more you do that. And so my whole thing was like, let's talk about things we can do.
Yeah.
Let's be open about that. And at that time, I wasn't even where we are now. I wasn't seeing all the, like, well, should we be doing this? I mean, I had those questions for sure, but those were in the back of my head, and I could throw those away.
Well, because you love your church and you want to trust your church. And at the end of the day, the people who are doing this, most of these pastors are not evil guys. Yeah. They're good people. Like, I've sat in the rooms with them. They're good people. Our minds and our flesh get twisted so easy, though. And like I said in the documentary at one point, it's just really easy. It's all too easy for a heart for ministry to become a heart for money, because you think you need money to do the ministry. So we're not bagging on these guys. Most of these guys are not doing this on purpose. Now, some of them, like Phil Pringle that we talked about in the documentary, that dude just straight up selling miracles, and that's got to go, right? The issue, though, is when you talk to a church about these conversations, some churches and leaders are going to open up about that and say, okay, let's talk about that. How can we be more transparent? What can we learn? Others are going to say things like this, and you guys may have heard this before. I've heard this many times. I've heard this towards people who were asking questions, okay, more so than me. But when people ask questions about how it's being spent, if you can't trust us, you need to find a church you can trust to give to. And what they do is they turn it around. Instead of saying, you're right, we're not telling you how we're spending this money. Did we spend the money the way we said we would? But instead of giving you transparency, we gaslight you into saying, there's a trust issue with you, and you just need to find another church if you can't give here. I love this. So we did this documentary, super heavy. My wife and I are super, super heavy. She's watched me walk through this. I literally got sick before I finished the documentary, physically sick, physically ill for days. And it took a toll, right? So we're at church this past weekend, and our pastor gets up. He didn't even speak because he was supposed to be out of town. But he gets up to do the generosity moment. The generosity moment. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And we were so worried. Like, we looked at each other like it was bad. You know, what's he going to say? And this is a person we know, but those triggers still pop up. Like, oh my gosh, can we trust this? And he got up and he just said, hey, we want to give you the opportunity to worship God through generosity. Didn't talk about the tithe or anything like that. He just said, we want to give you the opportunity to do that because that's one of the ways that we worship. By the way, I'm supposed to be gone this weekend on a mission trip. I'm not, and here's the reason why. It had to get canceled for this reason. We are going. We are going to be spending that money you gave for that, specifically on that, right? But then he also said, if you want to give here, we would love it. We'd be so grateful if you partnered with us. But if you don't feel comfortable giving here or giving to a church yet, we get that. That's tough. Would you just give somewhere generously this week? Would you look for a place to give generously? And I love that because I've been at a lot of churches where they said, if you give to any sort of charity outside of us, then you're in sin. Yeah. Right. So there are also a lot of good. I say that just to say there's a lot of good churches that are getting that. That's a generosity heart. We'd love for you to join us. We'd love to partner with you, but just go be generous somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, the pastor down in Alabama,
I think you're referring to Chris Hodges and the sermon we broke down, correct?
Yeah, I was trying not to name names this time.
Well, but and the only reason why we name names is because we're pulling a public record showing the sermon, so I did want people to be able to go back if you reference something.
And you can bleep this part out if you want to, but their church planting organization already makes me want to throw up. But when just hearing him talk, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. He basically said, if you don't have a heart for this house, if you don't have a heart for generosity to give to me and this ministry, then this isn't the church for you. Mm-hmm. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. I mean, I'm sitting there listening. I'm like, that dude just said, get out if you're not going to give. And people are like, but I have relationships. I have a life here. I've developed, this is my home. This is my family. And if you're not going to give to me, you're going to lose your family. So you're like, oh my gosh, I have to give. And then, and that just, honestly, I was like, man, bless him. Like, seriously, may the Spirit just fall on him. And just a guy I like to listen to always says, "Get him, God." You know, I'm like, get him, because that makes me sick. Like, that's disgusting.
And on the outside of it, so when we broke down the sermon the way that we did, it was all in context. It was just one cut, kind of after another, also linked to the sermon so that, people can't say we're taking it out of context. I don't think that Chris Hodges or Church of the Highlands is a bad church. All right. I don't think that Chris Hodges is a bad dude. Okay. I've got family that goes to Church of the Highlands, loves Chris Hodges. So I'm not attacking anybody. But when I heard that, my thought was, I don't even know if he knows he's manipulating people. But whether you know it or not, like even when we talked about like the body language stuff he was doing, which if you hadn't seen it, you just need to go back and look at it. But the body language stuff he was doing, like showing his hands for people to trust him and stuff like that, a lot of people don't know they're doing that because master manipulators, people who are good at manipulation, they're born with a lot of those things where they don't have to be trained. They're good at it. I say that because I was born as a master manipulator. Like, guys, we're not attacking these other people and saying, oh, we're self-righteous. Like, no, I can manipulate with the best of them. I lived in a narcissistic household. I'm higher on the narcissism scales if I am not constantly fighting it. So I don't even know if he was doing it on purpose. This doesn't make him a bad guy, but because I can see that, I'm so careful not to manipulate people, right? It's one of my greatest fears because of just the things I've seen in my life. So I saw it. I'm so glad, Buck, that you saw it when you were walking through it. We just wanted to show people the thing to say, hey, he's literally saying, and I believe his heart, I believe he thought we're not manipulating you, while not realizing we're using the idea that we're not manipulating you to manipulate you worse than the slick video or the story that he was talking about, right? And for a lot of churches, that's the issue, was he said, this may not be the church for you. And they feel good about it by saying, hey, go find another church. But I've got an interview coming up on this series, The Church That Business Built, with a friend that I met online, Ken Arrington. If you haven't checked out his stuff on TikTok, we'll talk about that then. But he, missionary scholar who does a lot of history work, like just loves history, church history and stuff like that. But we were talking about the same thing. When you leave church, and we talked about this on previous episodes, when you leave a church, you're leaving your family and your community and your friends and all those things. So if you think giving or not getting behind people being saved, the way, because, when you're using big numbers, if you can't get behind 16,000 people being saved in a year, something's wrong with you, right? Then if you do leave a church because you feel uncomfortable with how they're giving, you'll lose your entire community. And there are people who are listening, they're probably saying, Jeff, that's hyperbole. I've got people who I cared about, who I think would have done anything for me to protect me when I was a part of their community. And now, anytime something comes out on the podcast they don't like, without using my name, they're attacking me.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they would spit on me if I was on fire. So we've lost so much community. There are others that still love us but won't talk to us because they're scared of what that would look like. You guys have experienced that too, right?
Yes.
So there's a lot that people lose when they leave. So if you're afraid what would put me on the outs of this church is not giving generously like this, then of course I'm going to give generously in that moment if I was on the fence. And that was one of the last things he said. That was like the get you over the hump if you don't feel comfortable giving, right?
You might as well just tell your wife that, I got to be careful how I say this, but if you don't cook right for me, then you're not the woman for me. You know what I'm saying? That's what you're saying. And it's just, so no. And when you continue to stand on stage and say, I'm not manipulating you, you're saying that to justify your actions in your own heart because you're trying to convince yourself that you're not manipulating. Yeah. And so the more you tell me that you're not trying to manipulate me, the more I hear, hey, I'm trying to convince myself. And so something else that hit me, so Stephen Furtick, I don't know if you've seen the documentary on Pastor's Shoes.
I haven't, but I know a lot about it.
That's a good one. But there's a documentary and there's a lot going around about Pastor Shoes. I mean, these guys wear $600 shoes. Like they have to have
I wear
the latest
$30 shoes sometimes.
The ones I got on, I think, were $150. But I got the ons on. But
well, today I got the sweet custom Hey Dudes on. Those were not $30 shoes. But
yeah, but we sit there and we think, where's your heart? like, and that's just, and it shows to me, it just shows heart. And
there's nothing wrong with wearing nice shoes, guys. Like literally, I'm wearing a pair of custom shoes right now. They probably cost like $150 or whatever. But like the whole preachers and sneakers account and stuff like that.
yeah, there you go.
When you tie together the balance sheets that we talked about, the massive amounts of money, like the highest amount of money we saw was net assets of $500 million. But all of the churches in the top 100 that we highlighted, man, they all except for one had huge surpluses. Even the one that had a deficit had such a massive set of net assets that, oh my gosh, like they're fine. Like they could lose tens of millions every year. When that's going on, you got people tithing, you teach tithing, and people are giving sacrificially to their last dime in these miracle offerings. And then at the same time, your pastor is living in a house or wearing clothes or wearing shoes that are way beyond the price tag of the average parishioner. It's just not a good look. Like, and it may be, I'm not checking anybody's heart on that, because it may be that you have money from something else and you just really love shoes. But we got to be careful, because a lot of pastors in these situations, big balance sheets, and then their lifestyle doesn't look anything like the lifestyle of the people that they're reaching. And that can be a red flag if you're not transparent about it. So if you're going to do that, just be transparent about it. Be like, so I've got a pastor friend, loves kicks, doesn't make a ton of money. He doesn't live a lavish lifestyle in any other way, but he tells people, I love shoes and I have tens of thousands of dollars worth of shoes. Don't judge me, but I'm going to coupon it when I go to the grocery store because I don't have a lot of money, but I love shoes. That's fine. But we got to be transparent, because otherwise people are asking questions, and the church should be the most trustworthy institution in the world with their money. And I mean, the truth is we're just not right now.
I think part of the issue, a big part of the issue, besides all what we're talking about here, is you've got that hyper prosperity gospel. You've got preachers who are like, I live in a 40,000 square foot house, like bragging about like this.
God's blessed me.
I think it was, I know we don't typically name drop, but I think this is public. I think it was T.D. Jakes who said, if you don't like a rich pastor, this is not the church for you. They'll be straight up, they'll just be straight up saying, hey, this is what it is. This is who I am. And if it's not for you, then you can leave now. I think that's a big problem, because people can't trust the church when they see those big names that are really out in front of everybody, like Joel Osteen. Now, I read somewhere a few years ago that Joel Osteen doesn't even take a salary from his church. All his money comes from his book sales. I mean, I've heard in the past that, sometimes people get the New York Times bestseller list by their church buying all their books, and that was on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. That's what they did with Mark Driscoll's books. So you've got the people who get on the bestseller list. You got these pastors selling books. They might get their money from that, but I've also heard of like on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, where they said that they would buy hundreds of thousands of these books. The church would buy them, so he would get automatically put on that New York Times bestsellers list, because you have to sell a certain amount.
Yeah, so that's all the rage right now, is big pastors saying, hey, we actually have stopped taking a salary from the church. In the video that we were talking about from C3, Phil Pringle actually said that. It wasn't a part that we put on the podcast because it wasn't attached to any of those other stories, but they stopped taking a salary from the church, but they're making money off speaking engagements that come from them being the pastor of this church, that a lot of times the church is paying the travel on, or they're making money from books and stuff like that, right?
Well, and wasn't it reported that, like, in Hillsong, Brian Houston, on one of those documentaries, that they had like a multi-million-dollar expense account as well? They may not get. I don't know if he took a salary or not, but
So there's a lot of those things, though, that even when pastors say, "Hey, we're not taking a salary from the church," they're making a lot of money through those things, right?
How about housing allowances too? Like things like, it's not a salary; it's just a housing allowance for my $10 million house.
Yeah. Well, and that's an IRS thing in general. But like I'll say this: sometimes these pastors get put on the bestseller list, right? So I become a best-selling author. Now I'm making all this money, okay, and my pastor looks good. But I got on the bestseller list. Like, I work, in and out of publishing with my, with my business, right? Yeah. The bestseller list can be gamed if you have enough money. Yeah. All you have to do is you have to sell 10,000 copies in 1 week, and the time frame for that week is determined by the list. So like Amazon, it may be Tuesday to Tuesday, and New York Times, it may be Monday to Monday, and I don't think I have those dates right because I have to look it up. Yeah. But you can get on the 3 big list just by selling 10,000 copies. I know of churches that have ordered the 10,000 copies themselves for the pastor's book to get them on the bestsellers list. Years ago, a few years back, there was a lot of news reports that came out. There were companies that churches were paying to basically do that, where we pay you to buy it and get us on this, bestseller list, right?
Yeah.
But there are multiple churches that I know of right now. As soon as I say this, they're going to move them. But I know of right now that we could walk in, and if they would let us just go look around, I can take you to where they have pallets of books stored.
Mm-hmm.
Pallets of unsold books that were bought with tithe money that enriched the pastor's pocket, enriched the way that the pastor looked, or just made them feel better, right?
Yeah.
Just made them feel better in general. But now you've got pallets of dusty books that are sitting there years after the fact. And sometimes they'll get thrown away.
Yeah.
They'll get thrown away. They'll get burned. They'll be donated or whatever. And that is big time tithe money that got spent on stuff like that. And it doesn't stop at books. A lot of that happens. So I think the biggest issue, Shawn, for me is when these churches are bringing in millions of dollars above and beyond the tithe in the miracle offerings, and then they spend money like that and it doesn't bother them.
So for me, something that I was going to say earlier, and before I say that, think of the business implications of that. I'm a marketing guy, and so what happens is the church is willing to do that, the executive teams or whatever, because it's going to give their pastor a specific status. It's going to get his name out there, and when you get his name out there, that's going to bring more people in, and higher profile people in, and they're going to tithe more because they make more, and so eventually it makes more money for the church that way. And this may sound super cynical, but I mean I've seen it. I mean I know these processes, so it's a smart business move.
Well, yeah, because the more well-known our pastor is, if he's on these speaking circuits, if he's got this big book and all that, then people are going to trust our church more. One of the things we talked about in the documentary, it was one of the, I believe the Gospel Coalition articles, but it talked about with the prosperity gospel, why people buy into it so much. It's because we live vicariously through our pastors. Mm-hmm. If I've got a CEO successful pastor, and we're going to talk about CEO pastors on one of the episodes for the Church That Business Built series, right? But if I've got this successful CEO pastor in my church, then I feel more successful because I go to his church, right? But that is, when we talked about in the documentary, that is basically a revenue generating activity because even if you don't sell those books and stuff like that, it's going to bring more revenue back in the church. But that's thinking about it through a business model. When you think about the hundreds of stories that I have heard about people giving their last dime, not paying their bills, sacrificing everything that they had because they thought they were going to get the miracle, right? And then you think about that kind of waste, it's totally different. You think about the story, one of the guys from C3 who said we gave multiple years over 50% of our income during some of the worst years of business we'd ever had, to the point to where our accountant was saying, what are you guys doing? And we're going, you just don't get it. You don't get it. We're sacrificially giving for God. And spoiler alert, I'm not going to talk about it right now a ton, but in my interview with Ken Arrington, we actually talk a little bit about the widow's mite, and we'll link to a video where he breaks down the story of the widow's mite. The story of the widow's mite, we use that to teach people in churches about sacrificial radical generosity, and it's not about sacrificial radical generosity. It's actually about the exploitation of widows. When you read it in context, it's about the exploitation of widows. Never does God really say this widow is going to be blessed because she gave everything she had.
Wow.
Right before the story of the widow's mite, Jesus is talking to and basically correcting the Pharisees on how they're devouring widows' homes. Right? It's not always a good thing for us to sacrificially give the last dime that you have when God's already provided for you. Right? So anyway, I think it's dangerous, but the books is just one example, Shawn.
Oh yeah,
it's everywhere. Like I don't want to pick on anybody. This entire office is furnished with, the entire room we're in is furnished 90% with furniture that was just going to be thrown away by a church that decided we'll do new furniture, and they were going to throw it away. So we're like, hey, if you're going to throw it away in the dumpsters, can we at least use it, do something with it, so we're not wasting this tithe money?
Well, I've got tons of stuff from stuff that was just being thrown away.
Yeah. Now I'm glad that they said yes, because then it wasn't just thrown away, but it was going to the dumpster. So
wow.
Anyway.
And I think that we're called to give sacrificially. So when we think about tithing, we think about the Old Testament concept of tithing and all that, and we can break it down. And I'm not that much of a scholar on it.
We'll do a full episode on it. Really
Yeah, so I'm trying not to get into that too much. But when we think about it, my opinion is that Old Testament is 10%, New Testament is 100%. And what I mean by that is we come to the realization and the recognition that everything we have is God's and that we're just stewards. Yeah. And so we're called to give joyfully. So anyway, and we're called to live lives of giving, not just seasons of giving. So when we think about focusing on a season of giving, another thing that broke my heart just when I think about that is, they always do the miracle season. I've never heard it called that before. I love it.
It's called the month of miracles.
The month of miracles. That's shame on them. I hate the word miracle. So to me, and a lot of people disagree with me, that's fine. I don't believe in miracles. I believe that creation was designed to respond to the voice of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a miracle because a miracle is something that we can't explain. So we can't explain it. It's creation responding to the voice of the Lord.
Yeah, well, Jesus did a lot of miracles, but you want to know what he never did when he did miracles? Never once did he stop. Like when the woman at the issue of blood touched the hem of his robe, he didn't stop and go, wait, someone touched me. And if they will give a gift of $150, I'll heal them right now. He didn't go to heal a lame man and say, did you bring an offering? Do you have money? No, he just healed people freely.
Yeah. And so, but anyway, so this time of year, I'm one of those people, I'm like, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. Come on, people. But what it's done in the church calendar is historically this part of the church calendar is Advent. Mm-hmm. And what Advent is the time, the season that we look for the returning of Christ. And we have, instead of focusing on using this time to look for the coming of Christ, we're looking for the coming of money into our coffers. Mm-hmm. And it is disgusting and it's sickening because it's taking the focus off of Jesus and it's saying, hey, now the focus is on money. Jesus isn't the miracle maker. Your gift is the miracle maker. And it's totally a quid pro quo, and it's totally an adulteration of the gospel. And even if the people that are teaching it don't realize it, and I'm absolutely one of those people, if I'm going through a rough season, I will give a seed. But I don't sow seed into so I believe in seeds. I'm one of those crazy kids.
You like to use the seed language much more than I do.
Yeah. So, but I believe that you reap what you sow. So I will sow a financial seed offering just because and I call it releasing my faith, because I am sowing into the kingdom, and I do it joyfully, and I'm trusting God. Not, that he is going to provide for my family. Mm-hmm. So when I know that I start clinging to money, when I'm in a season and I'm like, oh, I've got to start hoarding money, I'll say, you know what, Lord, my heart's in the wrong place about money. Let me sow a seed. Sometimes I'll sow it to my local church. Sometimes I'll sow it to another ministry. Sometimes I'll find a family in need or find something else, but I'll look for fertile soil. That's some good charismatic language there. But I'll look for fertile soil and I will plant my seed in fertile soil because that's the way that's my conviction. But I do that from a joyful heart and a place of surrender, not out of guilt.
Yeah.
Not out of manipulation, but it's because it's my act of faith, because faith without works is dead. So it is my works behind my faith to remind me that I'm putting faith in God and the Father to be the provider of my household.
Yeah.
And that my job is to then go walk in the harvest and to reap the harvest that he has prepared for me. Yeah. And so I'm wholehearted in that. And it's really disgusting to me to see such a perversion and such an adulteration, and that they've taken a time that we're looking for Christ, looking to the return of Jesus, because that's what Christmas season is for me. It's like, okay, let's look for the return of Christ. Let's look forward to that. And they've adulterated that and perverted that so much, and it breaks my heart because we've taken our focus off of Jesus, and we put our focus on miracles, signs and wonders. Signs and wonders follow the gospel. Signs and wonders follow; they don't precede.
Yeah, and you can't buy signs and wonders.
You can't buy them. Yeah,
like when you give and when you say you're sowing that seed, think about what you said though. You said it's about, I realize I'm holding on to money too much, and I feel like God is saying, hey, give a gift that hurts just so you reset your heart around money.
Yeah.
Right? You give it to different places each time. You hear that from the Lord. It's something personal with you. It's not sacrificing to get something, and it's not sacrificing down to your last dollar as much as it is. It's just saying, hey, I need to give something that hurts a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? And when you give that, you're not giving $1 expecting 3 in return. Okay, and that's what most people are doing when they when they quote sow seed, right?
Yeah.
You're giving because the Lord told you to give. You're giving because you want to be generous. The New Testament concept of generosity was the church took care of everybody's needs. Nobody ever had a need. And we talked about this in the documentary, but the only offerings in the New Testament were relief offerings that went to specific people in need. That's it, right? So, I think about these churches, and I think about, when an offering is done right. How do I know when I should give to an offering? Because we don't want people to not give to the churches in this season. We don't want them to not give to an offering, right? How do we know when it's a good offering to give to? How do we know when it's okay to give that? What are some questions that we can ask beyond the ones I ask in the documentary? Because again, churches do need your money just like any other charity. And we're starting a nonprofit right now, and we'll be asking for money at some point, right? We'll also have completely open books so that you know, hey, where this is going. This is going to people's time to get this research done, to get these things done, right? But how do we know when it's good? How do we know when it's okay to give? How do we know when it's okay to give that sacrificial gift, even if it's not to an offering? What do you guys think?
I think, well, it kind of goes hand in hand with what you said. You sow that seed, and something I was thinking when you're saying that is you got to put in work in the meantime. Seed, you don't just throw a seed in the ground and then be like, I'll be back in a few months. I mean, that is something, and a lot of people do that with these offerings. Like, okay, God, I gave you money, and I'm just going to sit back and wait.
Yeah.
But it also goes, it's kind of that thing, like, how do you know it's good? You have to put in the work. You can't just sit there and be like, okay. I mean, okay, they give you the brochures. Several times you showed that, hey, this is where everything's going. And they even broke it down, like 12,000 is going to here and 10,000 is going to here. Look for it. And if it's not available, because it's not always available, then you can ask questions. And if they won't answer your questions, that may not be the place to give. You might need to find something that you can still give, but you might need to find something. So you have to really put in the legwork.
Well, if a church you're giving to a church and they won't give you the breakdown of where every dollar is going and how much of every dollar is going where, then what I would say is find the initiatives they're giving to that pulled your heartstrings and just give those directly.
Absolutely.
Because you can give to all of those directly.
Yeah.
Because there's something wrong if a church won't answer those questions.
Yeah.
But I like that idea, because when we look at it, instead of just trusting blindly, when we look at those numbers, there's quite a few of those churches that you realize, oh, they're giving a lot of money to missions. But then when you looked at the amount of money they were given, 17 million's going internal to the house, 2 million's going to missions, and part of that missions are, who are these organizations? Oh, this one helps churches do offerings like the one we're doing right now. That feels a little weird, right? So what you may do is you may say, well, I want to give to this specific, I actually feel called to give more to this organization that you brought attention to, so I'm going to give to it directly. Because this is one of my concerns and why I think we have to ask those questions. You and I, Shawn, we've seen this in churches. I've seen it up close and I've seen it from afar. They'll say things like, hey, part of what we're going to spend your money on this year from this offering, we're going to build wells in Africa, right? We're going to build wells in Africa. They don't tell you how many. We're just going to build wells in Africa. We're going to bring clean water. This is what we're going to be doing. Ask the question, how many wells are we building and how much does each well cost? Because there are churches that I've seen say that. They push that, and then they build 5 wells that cost $100 a piece. They spent $500 on wells in Africa, and they raised $2 million.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right? There are churches that will say, what we're going to do, one of our big initiatives, we're planting churches. We're going to plant 200 churches. We're going to plant 200 churches this year. Awesome. You put a number on it. That's a great start. But then you ask, well, how are you planting these churches? Where are you planting these churches? Oh, we're planting them through this organization. They're planting house churches. Each church, because it's illegal in the areas where we're planting the churches to do this, each church is going to have about 5 to 7 people max. They'll probably start with 3. Okay, so you're planting 200 churches with 3 to 5 people apiece. That is awesome. It's still good, but it doesn't feel the same as when you just said we're planting
Well, and it
100
doesn't
churches.
require $2 million.
No, it doesn't. So then, okay, well, how much money is that costing? And if I really have a heart for church planting, I might actually say the gift that I'm giving you, I could plant 200 churches through that organization on my own over the next couple of years, right? So ask those questions. One of the things I would say to know if it's a good offering or not, though, are they telling you, here are some places you can give your gifts to. If you give it to us, here's where we're going to give those gifts. Just give if you feel called. Or are they telling you a bunch of stories and saying, we feel like God's calling you to give this gift?
I don't think there's a problem telling stories. I'm a filmmaker, storyteller. Like I love, and even in those times where they ended up being manipulative, I loved telling stories. In fact, I know people on the team who that's what they did. Like they just loved it. And so it wasn't even about getting the money for them. It wasn't about the offering. It was like, hey, we're going to tell the story. There's nothing wrong with that. It's usually how it's used. And when the pastor comes up afterwards and says, okay, now because of that story, you need to give money. I think it's a good thing for people to see. People need to see. And I'm a visual person. Like if I hear a story, great, I'm going to forget it in 5 minutes. If I see a story, that might have a longer lasting impact. But seeing the stories, telling the stories, I think that's good. And then another thing you need to do is not just ask questions about what they're going to do with the money. Ask questions about what they did with last year's money.
Yeah.
Did they do the things they say they were going to do?
Good.
Did they make those wells in Africa? How many did they build? How many are you planning on building this year? Are you going to build upon that? Are you going to get bigger? And then really see. And if they won't answer those questions, no, you shouldn't blindly trust your church, because you have pastors who are CEO style pastors or whatever, who went to seminary. They don't know anything about business. They might not have a business bone in their body, which is fine. I don't think that's a problem. But then you're asking them to decide what happens to millions and millions of dollars when they've never seen that before in their life.
So, when I look at the biblical principle, and I talk about sowing, but I go to Mark 4 and it talks about fertile soil. So anything, and going back to what you were saying, I'm not going to give somewhere where the soil's not fertile, because I'm going to make sure that I'm not throwing my seed on dry ground in that reference. And so it goes back to ask for reports. Make sure that you can see where the money has been spent. If those fields that we are giving to and that we're sowing in aren't growing seed, then it's not fertile soil. If we don't see a harvest, if we don't see fruit from the previous gifts, I mean, if we were farming, we wouldn't continue to put seed there, and so, and it goes back.
And you're not talking about just like salvations and baptisms. That's what a lot of churches will use. It's like, no, from that special offering, what came out of that, what are we able to do? We're giving, part of what we're giving to is eliminating debt. Is the debt still going up? Like, what's happening here?
Yeah, well, and exactly. Yeah.
To that point, to some people listening, this is going to sound gross. Like, well, we should just try. Why don't we trust them? Why do we have to ask? We shouldn't have to ask, but you do. You can't, if you're not putting in legwork, if it sounds weird, gross to you to ask these questions, like if it's frowned upon, you're like, oh, we shouldn't be asking those, then your mind has been manipulated to think that you shouldn't be questioning this. This is the person, the man of God or the woman of God or whoever's doing it should not be questioned. And that's not the case.
No, because pastors are supposed to be above reproach, and you can't be above reproach if no one ever reproaches you, which means above reproach means when someone asks questions, I have an answer. You can't accuse me of something because I have I have an answer. I can show you the numbers. I can show you the data. I can tell you what I was doing. I can tell you where I was at, that sort of thing.
And if you don't know how to get it, if the pastor doesn't know the answer offhand, because some of them won't, they need to have a solution to how to find it.
Well, and exactly, because we're starting a nonprofit with everything with Church Disrupted, because the research that we're trying to do, the resources we're trying to provide, the training, it's just it's going to cost way too much. We don't want to make people pay for this thing as a business model. We want to be able to open up the community for free to people. Like there's all kinds of things we're wanting to do, especially on the research side. I want to be able to do more documentaries like we just did, which take a ton of time. But what we're going to do from the very beginning, setting up a board that any sort of, that they're having to approve money that's getting spent and whatnot. But anybody who ever asks us, hey, where are you spending the money? We're going to be able to tell them. Like, because for some of us, our time at times is going to have to be paid for, but people are going to know it's not extravagant. They're going to know where it went to. And exactly, every dime that people are giving is going to go to something that is expanding this mission. It's not just expanding somebody's coffers. And the only time it actually goes back to anybody involved with a nonprofit is when they're having to put their time into it. Right. So I wouldn't have a problem ever showing people those numbers. Normal nonprofits have to file their 990 forms. They have to file what's essentially a tax return, even though they're not filing taxes, to let you know what money's coming in, how they're spending that and all that. Churches don't have to. They're actually exempt from that. Churches should be giving more detailed financial reports without being asked, not less. But again, it's okay if they don't. Just ask. If they can't give you a report from last year's offering, I wouldn't feel comfortable giving to this year's offering if it was me.
Yeah.
The other thing, I think about for me is, Scripture says that the Lord loves a cheerful giver.
Mm-hmm.
I will never give out of guilt. Like I'm very sensitive. Like I get triggered if somebody makes me feel guilty. That's just part of my rebellious nature. Or if I feel manipulated in any way, like I just reject that. But if I'm not in a place of joy when I give, I'm not going to give because I'm like, that's not the kind of gift the Lord desires.
That's right.
He desires our obedience, not our sacrifice.
That's right.
And so when we're obedient and operating in obedience, we're cheerful, we're joyful, we have content. We're going to have, and we talked about this before, the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, and we're gonna exhibit that. So if we're like reluctantly giving, then we need to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. I just had to finish that, but we need to check that, and we need to say, wait a minute, why do I feel guilty? Why is this triggering a guilt feeling in me instead of a feeling of joy?
Yeah.
And it might be our relationship with the Lord. We might need a heart check there, or it might be that we're feeling guilty because our emotions are being manipulated and that we're being brainwashed. And that's what we have to figure out. Now, I think that comes with any Christian action, in my opinion, whether it's whatever we're doing and however we're living. If we're living from a place of guilt and condemnation, that's not Jesus. Scripture says that he did not come into the world to condemn the world, but that through him we might be saved.
That's right.
And so that's part of giving as well, that it's the Christian walk and the Christian life isn't one of guilt and condemnation. It's one of freedom from guilt and condemnation. And if we're giving in that freedom, it's good to give. Give. You absolutely give. Be generous. Be generous on every occasion, which I heard that in your documentary too. And I'm like, oh, that made me sick because it was a manipulated version of that. But
well, all those manipulations are coming from Scripture, right? But they're twisting Scripture. So again, so many of the stories that I've heard of, I felt like I had to give. I felt guilty that I wasn't faithful enough if I didn't give. I felt like I was cheating God, all these things. Even though they came into the church service saying we weren't going to give, after the stories and the push and all that, they felt like they needed to give. Any of that guilt, any of that shame that you're talking about, Buck, if you're giving, feeling like I need to give instead of I want to give, then your heart's not ready to give yet. Because, like you said, God loves a cheerful giver. The New Testament concept is about generosity. And even when you give, and you give a gift, and I'm giving gifts like this that hurt, right? They hurt, but we've already decided to give it generously. Like I've got some gifts I'm going to give today to some people who are in need. Okay. Well, that's a lot more that we're giving. We're giving directly to some people in need. It is going to hurt a little bit, but I'm cheerful about it. Like I decided to give it long before because as soon as I saw what they were going through, I said, I want to help. I can help. I want to help. My wife is the same way. right? But if you didn't plan on giving and then you had to get over the guilt, the shame, the fear of, oh, well, I don't want to be stingy, all that sort of stuff, then it wasn't God calling you in the first place. And one of the things we talked about in the documentary, Phil Pringle said it from C3, and then we'll land the plane, but he said, if your gift doesn't make you nervous, then you're not faithful enough with it yet, right? And I would say this, sometimes my gift will make me nervous, but if my gift makes me nervous, it only makes me nervous after it first gave me joy, and God put it in my heart. So if the nervousness is coming like on the front end of that, that's probably not God either. So again, guys, be careful. Give to churches, give to organizations that you feel good about. If you feel like God is nudging you to give directly to a person or to another nonprofit, and your church tells you it's not okay to give to another nonprofit, stop giving to that church. I would encourage you to leave that church because that's not biblical, right? But give to your church as you feel comfortable, as you feel called. But if your calling is always happening in the church service to give to it, there's probably something wrong there. If your calling to give is coming from fear of letting God down or responding to stories and stuff like that, which again, stories are great, but they shouldn't be used as a manipulation tool. Right. So I would basically kind of leave it with this. If at the end of the day, when your pastor's sharing the stories and everything else, and they say, hey, if you feel called to give, give. If you don't, that's great. If you feel called to give somewhere else, that's great. Not doing stuff like, the messages that we broke down from the last time where they make you feel like, oh, you're not following Jesus, right? If the Lord doesn't call you to do this, please don't do this. But if you want to partner with us in this, we'd love your help. Here's the reports. Here's all the things. If they do that, give. If there's a hard press, I would encourage you probably not to give, or at least to pause and ask those questions first. But let's be generous in this season. Let's look like Jesus in this season as he calls us. Don't be generous just because I told you to be generous. Be generous when you see a need and you feel like the Lord is saying, hey, give to that, right? But don't just be generous because you feel like you have to, because that's not how the Holy Spirit works.
I want to say something to pastors in this season too. It's an idea. It's just an idea. If being a marketing person, I've done all this stuff, and something that actually just kind of came to me through what we've talked about. If you're a pastor and you're about to do this big offering, here's a suggestion. All the nonprofits, missionaries, whatever you're going to give to, make a list and give people in your church a way to give directly to that. Say, if you give to us, we are going to give to them too. But if you feel more comfortable giving directly to them, we're going to give to them anyway, so you can go ahead and give to them.
That's really good.
If you do that, not only will that build trust with your people, you might raise a lot more money for those organizations that you're looking for. And then you can tell them, like, hey, but also if you give to those, we're also doing these things for our building, or we're doing these. Be open and honest and say, we still need help with these things, but if you want to give separately to that, that's great. If you feel okay giving to us too, that's awesome too. That's just, an idea, and I think that would help you guys a lot.
Because at the end of the day, even if you say, hey, we're taking 70% of this for internal ministry because this is what we feel like God's calling us to do, just tell people that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you to every pastor. We just want to say thank you. There's so many pastors who are doing this well, who have watched the documentary and said, hey, this made us sick too. Thank you for those of you that are being faithful, that are just saying, hey, we want people to give and we need them to give. And we know that even many times your livelihoods are determined and predicated on people giving generously. Yet you're not manipulating. You're just letting people know what they could do. Thank you so much for being faithful. And guys, I think if we would just return back to generosity, we'd be in such a better place. But a few red flags as we're getting ready to jump off today. If your church is manipulating you, that's a red flag. If your church won't tell you where the money's going, that's a red flag. If your church has an offering that's called legacy offering, kingdom builders offering, miracle offering, or heart for the fill in the blank, that's a red flag. Let's just look for some of these red flags. And if you see them, begin to ask questions. But again, we're pro giving, we're pro church, we're pro all of these things. But feeling like you're selling miracles, feeling like you're selling blessing, feeling like you're making people scared if they don't give, they won't receive that blessing. I think that's dangerous.
Yeah.
And I would like to see that end. But money's just one of the many ways that the business has built the modern church. And here's the sad part. I'm a business consultant and I love business. But when a church becomes a business, it is way worse than any other kingdom business because it wasn't created to be that. So in this series, we're going to keep coming back. Next week, I got a great conversation with Ken that's coming. We got others. We're going to talk about the tithe. We're going to talk about CEO pastors. We're going to talk about NDAs. We're going to talk about all kinds of other stuff. But we're just going to break down the church that business built so that we can find churches that are still operating as churches, not businesses. And also just to help people to say, hey, what are the parts of business that got in the church that maybe we need to take out? So yeah, we're going to be talking about this to help you find healthy churches, to help our churches get healthier. And I'm really excited about this series that we're going to be doing. We're also going to be doing a lot of reactions to smaller stuff. So outside of the podcast, if you want to check out our YouTube channel, we're going to be doing shorter reactions to, I'm going to be reacting to some of the work that Ken's done after people meet him next week, which is fantastic. We're going to be reacting to some stuff that Taylor Ransom has done that is satire. And why is it really funny satire? It's funny because it's true, right? So we got a lot of stuff coming in the series. We're going to build a whole playlist around it. But guys, thank you for your support. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for liking. Thank you for watching. And we hope that this has helped you to think about these miracle offerings a little bit differently. Like I said, next week, a conversation with Ken Arrington just about the church that business built, which is going to be fantastic. And guys, I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of a heads up as we're finishing. After we finish the series, the church that business built, and we are going to do other podcasts in the middle of that series when needed, but we're going to do a series called The Church That Celebrity Built, and we're going to look into that. The Church That Religion Built is going to be another series we're going to look into, and my favorite one we're going to finish with, the church that Jesus built. What is the church supposed to look like as we're helping people heal from church hurt and find good, healthy churches? So over the next year, we're going to be breaking down how celebrity and business and religion and all these things have twisted the church that Jesus wanted to build. So, hey, if you've been church hurt, if you've been through spiritual abuse, you've been through religious trauma, we want you to know today we love you. We see you. We understand what you're going through. We're here to help in any way that we can. But please don't give up on the church, because there's so much good about the church. There's so many good churches out there. And through these series, we hope to help you find really good, life-giving churches. And pastors, we hope to help you lead your churches even better, one step at a time. So we love you guys. We're grateful for you. And we'll see you next week, that conversation with Ken Arrington.